we start by giving you a quick review of what happened. So it was a Nimzo Indian declined, if you will, a Queen's Indian move order with knight f3, rather than, of course, knight to c3 and bishop b4, all of the Nimzo. And after d5 and g3, we quickly had a Catalan on the board. Bishop e7, bishop g2, Rekharovka, and then after dc4, queen c2, this was the first moment, right? Fabi, to you, b5, not the most popular move here, and gave Magnus a little bit of pause before his response.
Yeah, the opening was really fascinating, both from the chess content and also from how the players approached it.
Yeah.
So Magnus playing the Catalan, I think, shows that he is going to switch around his openings with white a lot. To start with, he's not really a natural Catalan player. He hasn't played it too much in the past. Of course, he's dabbled in everything, but it's never been one of his main openings.
Yep.
And also the Catalan is difficult to keep playing again and again because Black has so many decent defenses against it that you're unlikely to really prove an advantage in a whole match. And Jan played b5, a super sharp line.
Yep.
But he didn't seem perfectly prepared. So
yeah, and on that note, Magnus played knight e5, and Robert, you were drawing attention to that point, right? That despite b5 having been a move that maybe Jan surprised Magnus with, when Magnus played knight e5, suddenly Jan went into the think tank.
He did, and that's not a good sign when you play an aggressive variation, and immediately after this move knight e5, which has a clear threat of the rook on 8, you go and think and spend a lot of time. He handled it well after this point, and he started with the move c6, but it felt like he wasn't in familiar territory, and that's really a bad thing against Magnus Carlsen.
Just for the record, in case we see this game again, for all those who may be still watching us live or watching this in review on YouTube, queen takes d4 and knight to d5 are two more popular moves and potentially very, very deep. c6 is not as common as those two moves. After a4, we get a very traditional Catalan type of compensation, with white having a lot of pressure and black trying to recover for the next several moves to develop the queen side and catch up to white's very active pieces. Knight c3 came, and then after f6, we all stopped here and said, look, f6 was the right thing to do, right, Bobby? You were suggesting it was played, but we knew it was coming with consequences for the rest of the game, right? The e6 pawn and the weak king.
Yeah, you know, I actually just had a thought a second ago, which is that Magnus paused after c6, but he played the move a4 relatively quickly after some thought. I was wondering if black plays instead of c6 knight d5, and white plays knight c3, and black plays c6. White can play a4
and we transpose.
And transpose. So maybe he was just trying to get back into a line which was familiar to him.
Okay.
And maybe this shows his intention after knight d5.
Okay. Interesting. Makes
so
sense. Okay.
So anyway,
we come back.
We came to a super complicated position, very double-edged because, you know, black has weakened a lot. On the other hand, of course, he's up a pawn. And Jan came up with this interesting
idea that we were all reacting to, because queen just doesn't look natural there. And there were tactics coming in a lot of variations on different diagonals. In hindsight, it kind of worked out. He had a defensive setup, but Robert, you just gave me a quick look. Your thoughts on that?
No, the next part of the game was really interesting because the queen is sort of stepping on the toes of black's other pieces, but it defends everything. And as the game continued here and white went forward with e4, it was a position that felt very dangerous, and Magnus had a choice. Do I play for d5 or for e5? We ended up liking his e5 choice in the next few moves because it opened up the entire board, but just immediately afterwards, he didn't handle it correctly because he traded on f6, which was great, playing good moves. And then this knight e5 move, that was an imprecise choice.
Yeah, right
he must have missed something in Jan's response after bishop takes e5 and knight a6 to c5. Because white is the one now with vulnerable squares as well. It's not just the d6 square. It's b3, it's d3, so those knights are hopping in.
And when we saw Magnus looking at his score sheet a bunch, because Fabi, now that we're looking at it here, putting the whole story together that we've now watched for the last 6 hours, right? You were thinking maybe he was still in prep. He was just checking his move order, which means maybe he was thinking about this position here. You rejoined us after Hou Yifan left and said that you really thought after the next move, not knight e5, but knight takes f6 was the key for white to keep an advantage, with the main point being everyone rook takes, allows knight e5, and this transition is just very strong for white with the tempo on the rook and the crazy pressure coming here. And so if you can't take with the rook and you take with the pawn, now your point was that this position with the bishop pair maybe gives him better long-term chances, right, to speak for you. But go ahead.
I don't think he saw we were, of course, speculating on what he was thinking about at the end because there's so many moments in this game. It was a very complicated game where he could have been thinking about, even later on because it looked like he was getting a somewhat promising position later on. Or even earlier in the opening, maybe he was thinking instead of e takes f6 something. But this is the moment where I feel like knight e5 was probably not the right choice.
Yeah.
Knight takes f6, I'm not sure if white is really better because after pawn takes, the line you just said, bishop h6, and rook f7, it's difficult for white to find the next move. White doesn't have any clear targets. E6 is kind of easy to defend with rook e8. The knight on d3 is stopping a lot of white's development, so maybe he could have thought about knight e1 here. But for sure, he's not worse here, and in the game, he was getting worse. So
So in the game, as Robert just said, he played knight e5, takes, and here came knight a to c5, and suddenly we realized in real time that black's advantage was growing and that probably the best practical decision was to go all in, allowing the obvious threat of knight b3, which forks the rook and the bishop, winning the exchange, in order to go all in for the compensation on knight d6, and that's exactly what he did.
And that was an amazing knight on d6 throughout this game, and black objectively is better here. There's no denying that. But it's difficult to get the pieces fully out. You need to play c6 to c5, offer a trade of bishops. And I like what Magnus did here with rook to d1, in case that's going to happen. He wants his rook attacking the queen on the d file. But then this was the curious moment. Bishop a8, we weren't expecting that because of that arrow you just had there. The knight can move out of the way, hitting the queen on d7. And Magnus chose not to do that just yet. He played bishop e4, threatening things on the king side, and that's quite scary because there's all sorts of menacing moves like queen h5, the h7 square, the sacrifices on g6. So Jan plays this c3 move, and first bishop a8, then c3, this back-to-back moves that we felt were not optimizing the position, and then Magnus really had an easy time of it after that where he was the one sort of pressing. So in just two moves, the advantage for black all of a sudden turned over to white, and it was never in huge danger, but Magnus was the one who could try for more.
In hindsight, you would agree, right, Fabi? This was the critical moment, the pendulum, if you will, right? If Jan was going to get a different result, it was probably here, whether we would argue it was queen e7 instead of bishop a8, or even after bishop e4, the concrete line we thought maybe black should go for, just call white's bluff.
Yeah, I think if the moment before he played bishop a8, he had more time, certainly an advantage, and a safe one at that. And I think queen e7 here was the right move, but bishop a8, bishop e4, I think c3 was really the moment. When I don't understand why this move was played. It looks like white has a lot of options after c3. We even mentioned knight takes b5 as an option. So why go for this when white has a lot of attractive or at least decent looking options?
Well, especially why go for it so quickly? Again, we were talking about it in real time, that he sat down at the board, and you made the point, no matter what you're doing while you're away from the board, you're looking at it on a monitor, you're thinking about it in your head, it's not the same. And he sat down, played c3, it was kind of vintage Jan in the vintage Jan that we don't want to see if we're a Nepomniachtchi fan, right? Because he does this so quickly, and as Robert pointed out, after queen c2, which is very forcing, g6, takes c3. Now when the queen takes, c5 is stuck. We highlighted how critical it was to advance this pawn, to open the bishop. Now you can't do so. And as Robert said, from here on out, white was in control.
Yeah, because the material advantage at first was a rook and a pawn for the knight. Now white has the same number of pawns as black, but black's pawns are way worse. Look at them. They're all split. a7, c6, e6. A pawn's best friend is another pawn. Those are some lonely pawns here. And the way the game continued from here, I mean, black did eventually play this move c5, but it came at the cost of this c5 pawn.
Yep. All these pawns are now targets, as we said. The transition, while there was still a lot to talk about in real time overall, we were already talking about variations here where when is Jan going to bail out? When is Jan going to bail out, right? Take on d6, and eventually, Fabi, you called it. You said that in this position, after the queen c7, when the knight was undefended, it was now time to take it.
Yeah,
and head to the rook ending.
I do wonder a bit if Magnus is regretting playing queen g4 and allowing black to simplify the position rather than. It's risky, of course, to try to keep the tension because they're both in time trouble, or potentially in time trouble, and things can get out of hand for either one of them. But it feels like white is the one who has pressure. So maybe Robert suggested a move like rook c1. Maybe there were some ways to increase pressure, and of course it would still be within the bounds of equality, but without allowing black to easily trade off pieces.
Good point. So rook c1, any other ideas? Because this is probably going to be our final thoughts in the game. We know what happened after this. Things petered out.
Well, moves which came to mind were also rook a3, but then black will possibly just try to play rook d8.
And there's no rook d3, which is what you want to play. Rook d3, protecting the knights, there's no sacrifice, but rook takes c4 suddenly becomes an option because too much is happening down the d file, and the rook on d8 is the one that gets the last laugh.
Yeah, this is why rook c1 was maybe a chance to play c5 after rook d8. Because if white gets c5, I think the pressure can get pretty serious. But black had ways to deal with that too. It's hard to criticize this decision to play queen g4 because it's an objectively fine move. And rook c1 wasn't leading to an advantage for white objectively, but it would keep more play in the position.
Right. Well, as we said, queen g4 was played. Jan used that as his opportunity to, as we say enough is enough. Head to an endgame where you pointed out white really has nothing better than to win 2 for 1, sacrifices the c-pawn to take care of the e and a. But unfortunately for Magnus, Jan is able to quickly get the queens off the board and head to a theoretically drawn ending where we had some fun analyzing and hopefully highlighting some instructive stuff for the viewers in chat. Because, it seems it's trivial for these guys, but there are interesting and instructive ways these endgames can go wrong. However, ultimately, it was a game of shuffle puck over there between the rook and king. And game 2 of the FIDE World Chess Championship came to an end peacefully, and that was your Coinbase Rapid Recap of just how it was. Chess.com's coverage of the 2021 FIDE World Championship is brought to you by our partners at Coinbase. Whether you're just thinking about making your first crypto purchase, just wanting to learn a little bit more about the crypto industry, or if you've been doing this thing for years and you're an experienced trader, Coinbase is the place to be. Visit coinbase.com/chess and get $5 in free Bitcoin just for signing up and verifying your account today. We really encourage you to do so. Go check them out at coinbase.com.